Hey, it's Joel. I want to give you a quick heads up. In this episode, we use some explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. If you've heard our previous podcast on the dark night of the soul, I'm still not at 100%, but let's see if we can navigate through this podcast and see where we can get. So we've actually been doing some work with Dr. Dario Nardi, who recently published a book called Magic Diamond, which I highly recommend going and checking out. It's actually fantastic. And while we were doing a workshop with him on this with a handful, about a dozen people, something came up for me as we were talking about integrating our 10-year-old or tertiary function and our inferior or fourth function. In the Myers-Briggs system, each type has 4 cognitive functions that are a primary. And the workshop was a lot about integration. And as we were talking about it, I described my experience of learning how to give weight to my auxiliary or co-pilot function of introverted thinking or accuracy over my 10-year-old or tertiary of extroverted feeling or harmony. And when I say give weight to, I mean, they're both really important. They're two sides of the same coin, and they must be used in conjunction with each other. And when I was younger, I would give weight to extroverted feeling or harmony. Like, I would prevent myself from saying things because I didn't want to offend people. I wanted to be nice, and I wanted to preserve my reputation and keep an emotional vibe going. And I gave preference to that over saying things that were radically honest, and things that I believed needed to be said. And of course, over time, one of the things that was my work in balancing and integrating those two functions was understanding that how you say something is incredibly important. So it's saying things that I believe needed to be said with my introverted thinking or accuracy function, but did so with a finger on the pulse of how it was making people feel on the other side. That said, and actually after I said that, there was an INTP in the group that kind of mentioned something similar about being this trickster archetype, sort of this Loki or trickster archetype that ends up sort of messing with people. And it struck me that as an NTP, and I have a lot of INTP friends. One of my best friends is an INTP. And it struck me that all we really want as NTPs deep down inside is we want to be liked. We want to be approved of. We want to be accepted. Like that's like, so it's like a yearning that we have deep down inside, is to be accepted and approved of and liked and connected. It's not something we talk about that much, I think, as NTPs, because on the other side of that coin is this compulsion to mess with things and to be a trickster and to sort of disrupt people's calm, particularly disrupt their ontological calm, right? Like they disrupt people's desire to emotionally attach to ideas that are not leveraged, that don't serve a lot of purpose other than psychological comfort, but actually have bad, like they end up having bad emergence. They're based on bad principles or models inside their mind. And it struck me that we end up with our personality types, we end up having a place in society that is the opposite of our core desire. Almost like in the Enneagram system, where our strategies are the opposite of our essence, right? As an Enneagram 3, I feel like I have to constantly be proving my value, right? I have to always be like showing up with value and worth in order to be approved of. But my essence actually tells me that I'm precious intrinsically, and so is everybody else. But the strategy has a hold of me, and I've got to always be showing up with value. But that's not my position. My position is to let go of all of that. My place in the world is to let go of that and then reflect back to other human beings the preciousness of life and the worth and value that things have. And I think that there's there's a corollary in the Myers-Briggs system. And this is just an idea that I'm playing with, so I don't know this to be true, but this is just sort of something that's surfacing for me, which is that as an NTP, particularly as an ENTP, my role in society is at odds with my little fragile desire to be liked. So which one do I have to do, right? Should I be showing up being in a way that allows me to be liked, or do I need to let go of that and be the provocateur, right? Be the person who disrupts people's psychological calm. And if I do that fully, and I fully accept that that's my role in society, and I let go of this need to be liked, then at the other side of that, do I hit a place of almost like type essence where I get that reward too? Right? Like that's part of what comes with it, is that when I fulfill my role in society, then society makes a space for that, and there's approval for that space. And it made me think of like INFJs, which all they want to be is left alone. INFJs just want to be left alone. They just want people to not dump all their problems on them, right? They just want some like mental space. And yet what's the facility that they do in the world? Like people come find them and tell them their life story and all their problems. And the INFJ can't help but serve that. You know, we've talked about it as almost like an emotional dialysis machine. So if an INFJ lets go of this desire to just be left alone, right? Like just get some space and not be vulnerable to everybody else. If they let go of the desire to be invulnerable to others, and they just accept their role in society, which is understanding how to navigate through complex emotional experiences to get to the other side of understanding oneself, and navigating that really sometimes very difficult terrain. Do they get on the other side a feeling of not being vulnerable to others, right? Because they fulfill their role in society, and by doing that, that facilitates them not being vulnerable anymore because they've traversed this terrain so well. And so I thought you and I might talk about this a little bit. I've already mentioned two types, ENTPs and INFJs. Maybe even ENFJs might fall into the same category as INFJs, just like INTPs and ENTPs kind of fill this sort of role. I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what that might look like for all the types. If they let go of this thing that is what causes a weight at the bottom of what allows them to become their highest potential. What is that weight for those types, and what does the highest potential look like?
The phrase that popped into my head that as you were talking is the phrase ambitiously lazy. I don't know why it came to my head, but I go through life often with ambition to get out of work. Like I work really hard to get out of work or suffering or challenge. I actually put more challenge on myself sometimes to avoid the real challenge. Like I synthetically create extra challenge. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about here in a way. It's almost like you are, as an INFJ, you're genuinely getting people bringing their stuff to you. And so you have built strategies and all this quote unquote workload upon yourself to keep yourself from being vulnerable. And sometimes it's harder than if you were just vulnerable and just let this stuff wash over you and surrender to it. Now, we also talk a lot about building boundaries and borders for INFJs, and you can't let everybody walk all over you. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying open yourself up and just let everybody treat you how they want and have nothing, no sense of yourself and just let people come in on your space. That's not what I'm suggesting. But there is this concept of we build all these fortresses and walls and these constructs in order to protect or keep things at bay or not surrender to them, when sometimes just surrendering to them is the easier thing. It's the more direct way to go about it and deal with the real work at that level, right? If people are coming up to you and you have all these defenses, so they never get in there. Maybe as an INFJ, you're really introverted, thinking heavy, and you've got a lot of snarky comments and a lot of ways to keep people at arm's length so you don't get hurt. People don't dump their stuff on you. And you're working really hard. Well, you're also missing out on the opportunity to create the real boundaries when you do let them come in with your extroverted feeling process. And so you're synthetically creating maybe boundaries or borders or walls and it's really hard and all this work. And there's still work on the other side of that if you let that down, but the work is more direct, it's more beneficial, and it's the real work you need to do. There's like the shadow work and the real work. And so what I hear you saying, Antonia, is it's not going to make it easier necessarily as you start to speak truth, as an ENTP, and you don't play to everybody's expectation of you with that harmony, extroverted feeling process at your 10-year-old or tertiary level. People are still going to be mad, and they're going to take things the wrong way and all that, but at least you're dealing with it directly. You're not trying to like do one level removed and just not say the wrong thing ever and always make sure things land and people aren't upset with you. It's like that's a lot harder than just dealing with speaking truth, deal with the fallout.
Yeah, I think on the other side of this, not all ENTPs or INTPs will resonate with what I'm talking about because they hardened themselves. They decided to go the other direction. Like, I became more sensitive in part because of my circumstances. I was raised to believe that I needed to be above reproach. And so I needed to always say the right things. I was very frequently punished for saying the wrong things. I'm also an Enneagram 3, which puts me in the center of the feeling triad or the heart triad. And so therefore I'm going to have more sensitivity. There's a lot of ENTPs out there that are like, they're head types. They're Enneagrams 5 through 7. And so they don't have this same sensitivity necessarily. They're a little bit more cavalier. And they may not have been raised to be, to think about this all the time. But that doesn't mean that they're not still experiencing the hit of being considered unacceptable in society if they're representing something that's not often represented. Like, society has a lot of checks and balances for what it calls radical thinking or outside the box thinking. And that makes sense because you can't adopt every new idea or new thought. It needs to go through a vetting process. The challenge is that society puts us through the ringer through social pressure, and that hits us where it hurts oftentimes. I think STPs feel this as well. That said, well, and of course there's going to be NTPs out there that are in the gut triad or anger triad as 8, 9, or 1. So we're going to respond to things differently. But that doesn't mean that we've found that perfect balancing through line, which is that it is our job to be, as NTPs, it is our job to be intellectually provocative. That's our job, to be inventive. We might do it through actual mechanisms and machines and that kind of thing, but more often we don't. More often we're provocative through just simply the things that we say and the perspectives that we take. And so whether or not you're hypersensitive and course correct that way, or you're hyper callous and course correct that direction, regardless of the two things, there's a sweet spot in between those two things, which is being provocative and taking the hit of the social pressure and registering it and being willing to feel a little of that pain, because feeling a little bit of the pain of rejection is part of how you calibrate the message to be able to say it in a way that lands with others. If you're too callous, nobody gives a shit about what you say because you're being too callous, right? Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. You know that old adage? If you course correct on the side of callousness, you're not going to be able to be provocative. You're going to be ignored. If you're hypersensitive, you won't be ignored because that's the whole point of it. The whole point of it is to be acceptable, but you're not going to say anything that is provocative because you don't want to take that emotional hit of being unacceptable. And so both sides end up not having the impact that an NTP is supposed to have in the world. I think NFJs do a very similar thing. I mean, we're talking about these two types, but I think all the types have one of these. NFJs, they sometimes course correct on the side of being like shut. They shut themselves off, and they don't. They have these impenetrable walls, and they will not allow anybody in, and they're spiky, and they have resting bitch face, and they do not want anybody messing with them. Or they course correct the other direction, and you just can steamroll over the top of them. Like they just hand themselves over, and they just get taken advantage of, and they're just pushovers. neither of those is going to help them fulfill their actual role in society. If they're pushovers, they're not going to actually be able to help anybody because they'll be too wounded to help somebody else heal. And if their walls are impenetrable, they're not going to be able to connect with another person and be able to communicate with them through all of those spiky walls and, moats and alligators in the moats or whatever. And so they won't be able to fulfill their role. You just mentioned, what was so funny is when you mentioned ambitiously lazy. I actually thought you were going to talk about NFPs because I think on some level.
Well, certainly we are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think on some level, I would ask you, because this is actually kind of a bit of an exploratory conversation. I'm just working through an idea. So I'm going to spitball about what I think maybe some of these different types purpose is and how they course correct in two different ways and what's that like sweet spot in between. I don't actually know what I'm talking about. Again, I'm just kind of coming up with this as I am. And I'm not at 100%, so my ideas might not be as good as they usually are. So you'll have to forgive me if that's the case. But what would you say that NFP's sort of role is and the two different ways they course correct that actually knock them off their role?
For NFPs, actually all FPs, I believe the role that they can often play is inspiration and motivation for others to become something, right? And in order to do that, you often have to embody what you want to inspire and become something yourself. And I see so many FPs doing what Julia Cameron talks about in The Artist's Way, becoming shadow artists, metaphorically or literally. And instead of going and doing the hard work to become the actor, the director, the photographer, the business person, like whatever the performance art is or whatever the inspiration is, we often will work 10 times harder to do the second best thing, like be the assistant to the movie director rather than the director, because we're worried, I might not have what it takes. I might give my 100%. It's not good enough. So I'll just do what I know I can probably do. And we end up having to work 10 times harder. We end up in these like secondary roles that tend to not be the actual inspiration we want to bring to the world. And we allow ourselves to be diminished in that way. I think this is where this shows up for FPs a lot, is this shadow artist element. And the hard work of being the actual creator, person that's inspiring, that's hard. And we know it's scary, and your ego is on the line, and you're getting vetted on what you're actually capable of, not what your imagination thinks you're capable of. Because when you're that second tier, you can always imagine, well, someday when I'm fill in the blank, I'll be awesome because fill in the blank. But now we have to actually go do that thing, become that thing, and be quote unquote awesome or not, and vet ourselves really. And so I think ambitiously lazy comes out for FPs in that we work so hard on all the things except for the thing that we should be doing to be that inspiration for others.
Yeah, I could see that. I can see a similarity with like TPs and FPs, regardless of whether or not they're intuitives or sensors. But I think that the distinction between like NTPs and STPs is I've recently gained a strong appreciation for the performance nature that STPs bring, which is different than the performance nature that SFPs bring. And I've noticed that STPs are at their best when they're calibrating in front of an audience. Almost like SFPs are at their best when they're performing in front of or expressing in front of an audience. STPs when they're calibrating in front of an audience. Like, the easiest way to see this is like sports. Like you have an entire arena of people that are either for or against your team. And you're figuring out how to reach your goal and win in a competitive way with an audience of people around you that is actually forcing you to be better in real time. And there's a lot of different applications around this for STPs. But I think the thing that they are the best at and what they bring to the world is an ability to show what humans are capable of, like physically, like somatically almost. Like there is an intelligence that STPs bring. I watched my dad do this, that everything he did, he amped up and did even better if there were people observing him do it. And I think that STPs they can do what NTPs do, which is withhold bringing their gifts to the world by course correcting it and either being cavalier and not wanting people's opinions or impressions of them be bad. And so they don't enter into those spaces that might require them to have some bravery to put themselves out there to fail in front of an audience. They can either be overly concerned about their image and the opinions of others, or they can go the other direction and be cavalier. And usually what happens when they go cavalier, they become freedom obsessed and they just don't want to be pinned down. And so they end up not performing at their best because an audience feels like it's responsibility. An audience of people looking at them, watching them calibrate in real time looks like it's something they don't want to be beholden to. And so they don't bring their gifts to the world of being like literally impressive specimens of humans by calibrating in real time. Like, again, it's so easy to talk about SPs in general as always being like physically doing things.
I'm thinking about like a rap battle, like an Eminem rapper
exactly
type situation, probably an ISTP.
Yeah.
Who is very articulate, and he got his start by doing rap battles in front of audiences and calibrating his style and his speed of being able to pull rhymes and articulation quickly in the form of rap. Well, it's an art form, but he was calibrating quickly in front of others.
Absolutely. I mean, my dad's number one talent that he did for 50 years and became extraordinary at it was public speaking. My father was an exceptional public speaker as an ESTP. And yeah, it's like, and every time he had an audience, like he would get better and better and better and better. And at the end, he was an impressive energy, like a force to be reckoned with. And I think a lot of STPs can be forces to be reckoned with if they allow themselves to find that sweet spot of being responsible to performance in front of an audience, but not overly impacted by the audience's feedback. It's like the sweet spot in between. And I think there's something similar for SFPs when it comes to expression and performance and art. There's a sweet spot of expressing better when they're being observed in front of an audience. But they have to have a thick enough skin to be able to not be that great to begin with, to fail a lot in the beginning, just like the STPs do. To fail a lot in the beginning in their expression and have kind of a bit of a thicker skin, but also be responsible to the audience and want to give them a real show. You know what I mean? Like really want to express their best to them, even if their best is getting better over time and they're figuring themselves out. Because I think SFPs, while they're figuring their art out in real time, they're figuring themselves out in real time. Like their art is them. It's an expression of who they are. And in some ways, they know who they are while they're serving others in that expression. So there's like a sweet spot in here of not being too cavalier, but also not being too sensitive. And I would say that NFPs are probably very similar. Although I will say that anybody who has introverted feeling usually has an easier time of not taking criticism hit so deeply. But they'll stomp off because they don't think that they're being understood. Like FPs, it's oftentimes when they get upset about a situation with bad feedback, it's not like they've taken the hit in the same way that people who use extroverted feeling do, which is like, oh no, we're not connected anymore. Like I've failed this person and we're not in simpatico anymore, and maybe this says something about me or whatever, because you hand a little bit too much of yourself over when you're using extroverted feeling. Like you have to create those boundaries to understand how not to do that. With introverted feeling, it's like, well, I don't have to take this, right? It's more of like an affront as a person. And well, if you're not going to appreciate my expression, you don't deserve it. So it's more of kind of that situation. And also there's a sweet spot in there of eating it, right? Of going like, no, it's not that they don't deserve it. Maybe they're helping me find that voice. And so, yeah, I think it's a slightly different but similar dynamic.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
So I think the only types we haven't talked about are the TJs, NTJs and STJs.
That's fine. I'm just kidding, TJs. We love you too.
Well, I think what's interesting about TJs is for those of us who aren't TJs, it seems like you're never punished for anything you do, right? It seems like the world just rolls out a red carpet in front of you and says, we like your building talents, so keep doing what you're doing. But I do actually think, and particularly in the modern world, there's a lot of attempts to create systems. There's a real need to create sustainable systems. In fact, I would argue that right now, it might be our greatest need. I used to think that introverted thinking was the leverage point. And I do think introverted thinking is a leverage point in the modern society. Modern society feels very emotionally heightened. And I think it's very much given to wanting the world to be in a certain way and fashioned after the individual. Each individual person has a very particular idea of how the world should be constructed and is very upset that the world is not constructed according to their image. And I used to think introverted thinking was the leverage point, but now I'm starting to realize that because most people do it so poorly, this idea, and simultaneously, we've been given a lot of propaganda. I've been part of the propaganda machine about how important it is to be a thought leader. The challenge is that most people are really shitty thought leaders, and everybody has a microphone. So right now, I'm actually understanding the value of, in fact, you talk about it, Joel. You mentioned on a recent podcast, which is action creates its own authority. What I'm realizing right now is that we need sustainable systems, high quality sustainable systems, better than just about anything, or more than just about anything else. And it needs to not be ideologically produced. It needs to not be something where a person's very convicted that the world needs to look a certain way. It almost needs to be detached from that. It needs to be seen in this as objective as humanly possible. What are the machines that create the best results? And we have crumbling infrastructure all over the world. Every country on this planet right now has crumbling infrastructure. And I mean that in both a logistical or physical way and also in a mimetic way. Everything is crumbling. And we are hyper attached to, and we are idealistically, attached to the fantasy that if we're all thinking the right thing, the world will magically produce what we want it to produce. And that's just not how anything works. It is a fantasy. And so I think TJs right now, as the champions of building and ameliorating systems, we need them more than ever. And we're in a time period right now where we're destroying systems one right after another. We take a hammer to absolutely everything. And so I would imagine that as a TJ, this would be almost kind of a scary time to be a systems builder. It probably is a heartbreaking time to watch systems be destroyed one right after another, knowing that people who are destroying systems think systems building is much easier than it actually is. It is so much easier to take a broken system and make it better, to ameliorate a system, than it is to build one from scratch. And yet right now, we're just taking hammers to everything. Some of these systems needed amelioration. They needed review. They needed to be looked at and made better. But right now, we want to burn everything to the ground. It makes me think of the Joker quote in Dark Knight, Where he's like, do I look like a man with a plan? I'm a dog chasing cars. And I'm like, that's what it feels like everywhere to me. People are taking hammers to everything. They don't look like they have a plan. They look like they're dogs chasing cars. So I think TJs probably, unlike other time periods in history where we gave honor to systems building, this is probably a scary time for them. And I can imagine that they would also be feeling the same thing. Do I take a chance and try to build a system only to have it be torn down by people who don't understand, like cannot appreciate the value of true systems building? Or do I join them and destroy everything?
I think the other fear potentially here is that a narrative and intent will be projected onto the system that's built. Really, if you think about a TJ who has a backseat of introverted feeling, there's an insecurity of, oh, if I build a system, someone's going to label me something with intent that the system itself had an intention to harm. I didn't intend it that way at all. I just wanted to build something that worked, that was a platform for others to use. And I just realized when I bring my gift to the world, ill intent's projected onto this? That is weird. So backing off of that and feeling a little uncertain can be challenging, I think, for TJs right now, because there could be fear around that projection.
Oh my gosh, what an amazing observation. Just like TPs can fear saying the thing that needs to be said because they'll lose connection, TJs may fear building the thing that needs to be built because bad intent will be projected onto it. And that hits them where it hurts. What a good observation. And so there's a sweet spot. The sweet spot is being willing to take the risk of having bad intent projected onto them, while at the same time keeping a finger on the pulse of their intent, making sure that their intent is passing their own filters of positivity and a desire to ameliorate and build something sustainable and good that doesn't just serve them, but serves. I mean, if it's sustainable, it means it's serving everyone. And being willing to take the hit of that bad intent being projected. Because really right now, projecting bad intent is, it's one of society's biggest weapons.
It's the air we breathe today, right?
Yeah, it's like society has somehow caught wind of this whole project bad intent onto people. They also caught wind of idealism around perfection. Like, I've never seen a more perfectionistic society. This idea that if you go back far enough and anything's bad ever in the past, then that person must be canceled or the statue must come down or whatever, is an extraordinary, it's an extraordinary tool to wield that you don't think will be visited upon you again, like visited back. It's like that. I keep thinking about that, like the statement that Jesus made that those who live by the sword die by the sword. Those who live by shame and guilt will die by shame and guilt. Like, everybody has a past. Everybody's fucked up. Everybody has done something that they shouldn't have done because we're humans and we're imperfect. And having this standard that is impossible to fulfill and say leadership can only occupy, like, we will only look at leadership that has been perfect throughout their entire life. Well, I actually think that it's a desire to undermine leadership in and of itself. I think it's actually, people don't like the concept of having to be under leaders. And then at the same time, look at how people are starving for leadership. Like, they can't do anything without it. So eventually society will have to course correct. They will have to catch wise that they're completely shooting themselves in the foot.
Well, it's a rejection of most good leaders got there through competency and experience. And it's a desire to skip steps and not have to build competency and experience. If the metric is purity, well, the younger and less experienced are more pure because they've made less mistakes. So it's an easier metric to throw into the world, and then you tip the balance in your favor.
Absolutely.
If you're a younger person. Absolutely.
Yeah, you're right. It's a desire to democratize literally everything, including leadership. And not everything can be democratized. And leadership shouldn't be, right? Not everybody is a leader. Everybody should be self-leading, but not everybody should be leading other people. I mean, I'm not much of a leader. I know that one for a fact. I'm terrible when I have other people under me. And I know that about myself. And so I try not to put myself in positions where I have to manage others. And there are, again, we live in a time period of fantasy. And so part of the fantasy is that everybody's equally capable and equally competent and equally deserving of positions of leadership, which is just not right. But you're right. I think you're dead on accurate that if purity is the metric, then younger people will qualify more. But if competence and capability of leadership is required, then you're going to want people who are seasoned through their mistakes to understand that. And that usually belongs to older people, which really, honestly, older, wiser people should be in positions of leadership. They just should.
I'd rather have people in charge that have made a lot of mistakes than not. That seems like wisdom to me, because then they're going to know how to navigate through challenges, and they're going to have self-esteem because they have navigated challenges.
Well, it means their mistakes are behind them, not in front of them. And anybody who's using purity as a metric for leadership, if they haven't made mistakes, it means all their mistakes are ahead of them. And do I really want them to make all of their mistakes while they're in a position of leadership? Or would I rather their mistakes to be behind them so that they can learn from them and be better leaders going forward? So, yeah. So I can understand, going back to the point and not the tangent of our opinions on how the world is panning out right now, going back to TJs, both NTJs and STJs, I could see them not doing fulfilling their positions, the thing that they're best at, which is building and managing sustainable systems. NTJs like strategizing those systems and understanding how to ameliorate what is already there, and STJs ensuring that the positions to keep those systems going are occupied by quality people and quality talent, and ensuring that they're managed well. I think I think that could be really scary in the modern world, and yet we need them so badly. So I don't know if we're right on this one, but this was just us spitballing. I do like this idea, though. In fact, I'm really, really I think that there might be something. I think this is like the mustard seed that turns into the huge tree later. This idea that part of really coming into our own and our potential as these different personality types rests on us taking the hit of being hit where it hurts by society, and finding a sweet spot of not being in reaction to how we're perceived, or not being in reaction to what we think will happen to us, but fulfilling the roles that we fill in society, really fulfilling them and doing them well, and being in response to the needs of these places that if we don't step up to them, go unoccupied and are super necessary. And understanding that if we do it well and we can find that through line, not the reactionary, but the responsive through line, then I think actually that we end up getting the thing that we originally feared we would lose. As TPs, we will be the people who are impressive because of our physical or our mental provocation. Like, we are provocateurs, and we do well at that. And the better we do and the more seasoned we are, the more we're beloved, actually. For NFPs, the more that you're able to fulfill your role of being inspiring, the better you do at that, the more the world creates space for you to bring your art to the world in whatever way that looks. For NFJs, the less you fear vulnerability. I guess we didn't talk about SFJs, did we? I think SFJs have a very similar position as NFJs. I think SFJs, and I'm so sorry we missed you, SFJs, but SFJs fulfill a place of kindness and managing the day-to-day life. Like, SFJs are extremely good at managing day-to-day life and managing the lives of, or helping manage the lives of the people around them. And I think sometimes they feel unappreciated. In fact, most of the time they feel very unappreciated. And the response can be to get harsh, right? Very critical and judgmental and harsh. Or it can be, again, to be a pushover. And just like with the NFJs, to be steamrolled and to find yourself losing yourself to these relationships and not really having boundaries or an identity of your own. But I think the sweet spot for SFJs, just much like NFJs, is to be willing to show up for these people and then clearly communicate exactly what you're doing for them, right? Not to get hypercritical, not to get judgmental, and not to hand yourself over, but to make sure that you're working into the system that you create of getting needs met. A very, like you're the linchpin. SFJs are almost always the linchpin of any world that they're in. And being willing to articulate that. And I think that when an SFJ does it right and they're in that sweet spot, they're not pushovers. They don't just do whatever anybody tells them to do. They have strong, good boundaries. And at the same time, they have other people's needs, the finger on the pulse of other people's needs. I think those are the SFJs that everybody can't live without, right? And then they get the appreciation that they rightly deserve, as opposed to being overlooked. Or taken for granted. So sorry, SFJs. I'm sorry you got pinned on at the end and tacked on at the end. But regardless of what role you're filling, whether you're an FJ, an FP, a TP, or a TJ, we just went on about the importance of TJs. I do think that there's something to be said here for transcending the fear of being hit where it hurts you, and finding that sweet spot in society, that role that you fill, and then getting all the rewards that come with doing something well. But you just have to be willing to go through the discomfort of potentially losing it for a time as you're finding your footing and your seasoning.
Where have you done this in your life? Where have you, for your personality type, had that bravery moment, that hard work? You switched from being ambitiously lazy, constructing all this extra stuff on the side to prevent going into the real hard work. Where have you made that jump? What's the hard work you've done? Or what's the hard work in front of you that you need to do and move into? We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. You can leave your comments, ask your question, and also share your story. Stories are really important. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your voice and what's going on for you, what's coming up for you as we talk about this issue.
If you think that we weren't accurate about your type, if you understand the underlying principle of what we're talking about, but you think that there is a little bit of calibration.
Nuance.
Yeah, nuance that we might have missed in this, I would love to hear that. I would love to hear that, particularly if you're, like we tacked on the SFJs at the end, and I'm so sorry, but if you've got something to say as an SFJ that you think is really sort of fits this principle of what we're talking about better than what we said, I would love to hear that, because this is a work in progress. This is a germination of an idea.
You keep apologizing for stuff, and I got to call you on this. We're getting some feedback from people that are listening. Stop apologizing, Antonia. and what's interesting is I can see an extreme yin-yang here for you. I mean, in the context of this conversation, you've dropped the F-bomb in the last episode and in this episode, and you're much more free with your language. I can see you trying to get into introverted thinking and not worry about exactly landing things. You're bringing some profanity in to what you're saying. You're being a little bit more opinionated on maybe world events and things of this nature. And you're also apologizing. I can see like the struggle between the introverted thinking and extroverted feeling in you.
I don't think I'm apologizing for what I've said. I think actually this is me staying in introverted thinking by requesting calibration. I think I'm glad you pointed that out though, because I hadn't seen it. I think you're right. I have gotten some feedback that my apologizing for talking too much is actually one of the things that people say I shouldn't apologize for that. So I've actually, the last couple podcasts, given myself free reign to just do almost all of the talking. And Joel, you've been amazing about letting me do that. And I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm just going to do it. But that said, I think what I'm requesting is actually calibration, which would delight my introverted thinking. So if you could help me out with that, that would be awesome. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We have a book that's called Personality Hacker. You can find it on Amazon, Books A Million, all major retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And of course, we have a suite of personal growth programs that are designed for your personality type. And if you want to go check those out, that helps subsidize the podcast so we can keep doing it longer. So if that's something that's interesting to you and you want to invest in that and it's the right time for you, go check it out at personalityhacker.com under the catalog.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we're going to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.